Monday, July 5. The U-230 was scheduled to leave for sea in the evening. On this day, another passenger was assigned to the boat. Headquarters, considering the length of our trip and possible injuries to our anti-aircraft gunners and watchmen, replenished the personnel of the U-230 with a doctor. He arrived at the pier loaded with several suitcases, as if we were going on a pleasure trip. "Hello, Herr Lieutenant," he addressed me. "My name is Dr. Ray. I will take care of the health of your men. But I must confess that I have never sailed on a ship, much less on a submarine. Would you be so kind as to show me to my quarters?" Our guys listened to him with smirks and sometimes mocking remarks. I shook the doctor's skinny hand and explained in an apologetic tone, "Doctor, the submarine doesn't have a cabin in the true sense of the word. Nor do we have a room to store all your luggage. Please take only what you really need with you. That's about a quarter of what you have with you. Then we will go inside the boat." After the doctor had considerably reduced his luggage, I found him a place in the non-commissioned officer's quarters, where he took a bunk over the navigator's bunk. At sunset, we attended a farewell reception in the military town, then went in small silent groups to the submarine. No one, from captain to private sailor, shared his thoughts about the upcoming meeting with a deadly enemy. Everyone was well aware, despite the attempts of the command to conceal the truth, that the enemy had managed to sink 3 of the 5 submarines crossing the Bay of Biscay. On June 24 alone, the Tawnies sent 4 of our subs to the bottom within 16 hours. When the U-230 departed the pier, it was a completely moonless night. There was no band music, no noisy feast, and no crowd of us seeing off on the pier. We went to sea secretly, so that the French partisans or British spies would not learn of the beginning of our campaign. These days British intelligence followed us everywhere, in the military town, in the dry dock, in restaurants, and even in brothels. At the edge of the Brittany coast, where bare rocks protrude from the sea, we were met by a patrol ship and led south along the coast to the rendezvous point with the other subs from Lorient. The night passed without incident, and at dawn we joined U-506 and U-533. We were ordered, the 3 of us, to cross the Bay of Biscay, repulsing the British air raids with joint fire. Around the meeting place of the subs circled 4 escorts in full combat readiness. The 3 submarine commanders were talking on megaphones, discussing a plan for cooperation during the crossing of the bay. They agreed to move in the daytime in a surface position at a speed of 18 knots, but at night to go underwater, maintaining close contact, and again on command to surface at dawn. If the aircraft could be detected at a safe distance, the captain of U-533 was to signal to the other boats with a yellow flag to submerge. If he signaled with a red flag, it meant that the enemy aircraft had come so close that a safe dive was impossible. Then the 3 boats were to drive the plane back with combined fire. This wise plan, devised in offices by staff officers, was flawed in essence and completely unworkable. However, for want of anything better, the captains decided to stick to it. At 08.10, the 3 subs set a course westward in an attempt to break through the enemy's dense anti-submarine defenses. As soon as we moved in that direction, the escorts turned east, heading back to port. It was a hot, humid day, a perfect time to lie on the beach. High cloud cover was in the sky. A haze of fog drifted lower. The methox showed nothing. 3 busy hours passed without incident. 11.35. U-533 beeped a yellow flag. Immediately, we pellinged the plane at a distance of 10,000 meters on the starboard side. In 30 minutes, U-506, with the help of her new acoustic device, gave a signal to surface. The 3 boats simultaneously surfaced like well-trained seals. At full speed, they continued westward, leaving long foamy trails behind them. 13.10. Because of the cloud cover, jumped out Liberator at a distance of 3,000 meters. It was too late to dive. Immediately showed a red flag, and anti-aircraft calculations of the 3 boats took their places on the deck. The huge black bird descended to attack. But before entering the range of our fire, the plane made a turn and began to circle above us in altitude. 13.18. Another Liberator appeared in the sky, repeating the maneuver of its predecessor. Both airplanes circled above us at a respectful distance. I ordered to deliver more ammunition to the bridge and to the combat deckhouse. In such a situation, a dive was out of the question. Caught by surprise by enemy planes, the three submarines extinguished the desire of Tommy to attack single volleys. The roar of the submarine's working diesels, spreading from below, was supplemented by the roar of aircraft engines from above. 13.25. Sunderland emerged from the clouds and joined the two circling above us Liberators. Its appearance minimized our chances of a favorable outcome. 13.32. With the appearance of the third Liberator, a quartet of airplanes formed. Our chances fell to zero. It seemed that the campaign, which had lasted only a few hours, came to a premature end. We were expecting an attack from the air, keeping in our hearts just a grain of the determination with which we had set out on the trek. 13.40. The Liberator rushed to the attack. The anti-aircraft guns of three subs struck simultaneously at the pilot, who seemed to be committing madness by diving into a zone of solid fire. However, we were soon attacked from the opposite side by another Liberator, diverting some of the fire. We began maneuvering in zigzags in an effort to frustrate the attackers' plan. One of the planes, which fired during the dive from machine guns, U-230, dropped a cluster of bombs and passed with a roar only 3 meters from the bridge. 4 explosions followed, accompanied by heaving fountains of water. One of our anti-aircraft gunners at the lower gun began to stagger and collapsed to the deck. He was replaced by another sailor. A few seconds later, 4 fountains surged up near the deckhouse of the U-506. At that time, another plane was breaking through our fire screen. We lowered the wounded anti-aircraft gunner into the sturdy hull and delivered a new load of ammunition to the bridge. Suddenly, U-506 went underwater. 4 pilots Tommy decided that the moment was favorable and launched a decisive attack. But the unexpected happened. U-506 quickly surfaced, and her calculations rushed to anti-aircraft guns. The submarine turned sharply to the left, dodging the bombs dropped by Sunderland. The rumble of their explosions sounded among the tight claps of our anti-aircraft guns, machine gun blasts of airplanes, the noise of diesel engines and the roar of aircraft engines. The sea was foaming with exhaust fumes and bomb bursts. The air rang with shrapnel and bullets bouncing off the armored plates of the bridge fence. The Sunderland, coming out of the dive, caught up with anti-aircraft fire. It shuddered and fell slowly into the sea. After its demise, the other planes withdrew. For us, the moment had come to take care of our safety. The 3 submarines with their propellers spinning dived under the water in an instant. We had not yet reached a safe depth when the bursting of depth bombs showed that the British had not left us alone. This was the end of our group crossing of the Bay of Biscay. Soon our boat's communications with the other 2 were lost. Neither of them returned to port. U-506 was sunk 6 days after our rendezvous, and U-533 was lost 12 weeks later. Both boats were victims of Allied air raids. Dr. Ree, not yet recovered from his fright and seasickness, began treating our sailor, wounded in the upper right thigh. Fortunately, the bullet had not grazed the bone. Ree bandaged the wounded gunner with great difficulty, and when he had finished with that, dragged himself to his bunk, himself in dire need of help. For 24 hours, the pursuers continued to bombard us furiously. We were hunted in such a way that they almost drove us to madness. Dozens of times we had to go underwater, when we were followed by explosions. And yet, day after day for a week, we managed to evade our pursuers. When U-230 reached the relatively safe spaces of the mid-Atlantic, we surfaced from the ocean depths, marveling at our salvation. As before, other subs were less fortunate. During the same period, U-514 and U-232 were split apart on June 8, sinking U-435 a day later. On July 12, the enemy destroyed U-506 and U-409, and the next day British planes bombed U-607. All these subs were lost in the Bay of Biscay, dangerously close to the route of our movement. Passing the waters of the Gulf beyond the reach of land-based bombers, we submerged 2 or 3 times a day, moving most of the time in a surface position. The submarine was cleared of moldy and rotten food, the bottom scraped, and the waste thrown overboard. These we could not do in the bay. Mines were also prepared for setting and torpedoes for possible attacks. We were now spending wonderful days on watch, and under the bright sun we were tanned to blackness. The crew gradually regained their appetite, and some of the engine men went up to the deckhouse to puff a pipe or smoke cigarettes. The only one of us who didn't show his face in the sun or even get up from his bunk was the doctor. Rehe lay on the mattress, suffering from seasickness. Yellow and thin, he lay motionless on the narrow bunk, neither accepting nor demanding anything. However, when we made a regular dive, moving without rocking at a depth of 60 meters, the doctor rose from his leather bed, recalling his presence aboard the submarine. U-230 was moving stubbornly toward the Pelly. Almost every day we shortened the distance to the Chesapeake Bay by about 160 miles. Everything depended on the degree of intensity of the air raids. The flow of radiograms from subs in trouble did not stop. About this time, U-509 reported that she had been badly damaged during the repulsion of an air attack and was in dire need of spare parts. She did not report anything else. The radio operator was not only engaged in deciphering distress radiograms, but also received daily communiques from the Wehrmacht High Command. We were shocked by the news of the rapid Allied landing in Sicily and discouraged by the continued retreat of our troops on the Eastern Front. The world was going up in flames, its flames hitting Germany hardest, where we least expected them. Our Air Force, brought by Göring to decline, suffering heavy losses from the Allies, could not prevent enemy planes from destroying German cities to the ground. It suddenly occurred to me that the increased losses of our subs were strikingly similar to the air defeats of the Luftwaffe. But despite the bombing and destruction, the retreats and defeats, and the probable threat of our own deaths, we never gave up hope for the best. We were told that the war would be won, and we still believed it. Meanwhile, our boats continued to perish. On July 20, the watch log of one of our best friends in Brest closed forever. His last radiogram reported, "Attacked by airplane. We're sinking. We're being taken prisoner." U-558. The next day, we located the Catalina, a twin-engine seaplane. We quickly went underwater and stayed there for 2 hours, waiting for the pilot to stop pursuing. When we surfaced in the afternoon, black clouds enveloped the sky. Until evening, the submarine raced forward at full speed, taking advantage of unfavorable conditions for aviation, which were created by the approaching storm front. Night fell, but soon it was as bright as day. Flashes of lightning illuminated the sky. Dozens of fiery arrows stabbed vertically into the ocean and rose in zigzags from its surface, furiously piercing the clouds. Hour after hour, arrows of lightning raced back and forth, up and down, illuminating the sky with a million torches. A cannonade of thunder rumbled. The air was saturated with phosphorus that stung the eyes. After 5 hours of lightning and thunder, it rained. Its torrents poured into the ocean from clouds pierced by lightning arrows, to the accompaniment of thunder that rumbled between the sky and the sea. When the storm finally ceased, a new day was born. It was clearer and brighter than before. We had reached the continental shelf of North America. Expecting intensive air patrols in the U.S. coastal zone, we submerged at 09.45 and followed the set course at a depth of 110 meters, stayed underwater for quite some time, and planned our tactical operations for the near future. The crew remained seated in complete silence. Later, she was informed of the purpose of the hike. During the night, we surfaced. At 21.15, Prager prepared to send some flares to determine our coordinates. As he set up his sextant, I joked, "Determine it properly so we don't accidentally end up in the Panama Canal locks. What would you say, XO, if I took you into Lake Ontario?" Prager replied. We watchstanders laughed out loud, relieving our nervous tension. Prager added, "Don't laugh, brothers, we are on the right course." At 1:40 we noticed a shadow on the starboard side. It turned into a merchant ship. The captain of this vessel had his guardian angel on the bridge with him. In order not to be discovered, we did not touch him. All in all, the night passed quietly, except for a false alarm raised when Venus shone in the sky in all its splendor. The sky and horizon were deserted. Our stealthy approach was not impeded by any aircraft or U.S. Coast Guard vessels. U-230 continued at a speed of 18 knots. Directly in front of us was Cape Charles. During the night, we got some stunning news. The radio reported that there had been a coup d'état in Italy, Mussolini had been arrested, and Marshal Badoglio, the head of the government, had taken his place. If this news had not been reported by German radio, we would have taken it for disinformation. But as it was, it seemed implausible, though not very important. At dawn we dived under the water so as not to reveal ourselves. Moving slowly westward at a depth of 40 meters, we came within 30 miles of Cape Charles. Since we knew nothing about the U.S. anti-submarine defenses, the boat crew took up battle stations and prepared to fire the stern torpedo apparatus in case of a surprise attack. Shortly after noon, the acoustician reported the increasing noise of the propellers. Glavny raised the boat to periscope depth so that the captain could identify the moving object. To Siegmund's surprise, we were directly in front of the small convoy, much closer to it than the instrument readings had indicated. Only 7 transports were guarded by 4 destroyers. Suddenly, the captain shouted, "The boat is coming up, keep her under water. The bridge is already going out. Glavnik, lower her down." Friedrich took all the measures necessary in an emergency situation. No result. What the hell happened to that sloop? Siegmund was indignant. Dive quickly. As the U-230 hung like a fish on a hook in full view of the destroyers, precious seconds passed. Then slowly, maddeningly slowly, the boat began to sink into a layer of high-density seawater. Just as her stern disappeared, the ammunition cassette exploded in close proximity to us. The blast wave pushed U-230 under the dense layer, and the propellers, spinning at maximum speed, dragged the boat further down until it touched the sandy bottom. Astiques of American destroyers easily probed the shallow water, but could not grope our boat. Sound waves were drowned out by the dense layer of seawater above us. For nearly 2 hours, the hunters nervously surveyed the depths of the sea, trying in vain to locate a bombing target. Then they withdrew without even dropping a new cassette of depth bombs on us. In the night, we surfaced. We went forward at a rapid pace. For 3 hours, we were wary and excited. And then the harbor appeared ahead, a dim glow all along the horizon. The lights of Norfolk. A few minutes later, Borchert exclaimed, "America is right on course. We have arrived at our destination." Time, 23.25. Date, July 27, 1943. As a narrow strip of coastline rose out of the water, Prager's voice came from the darkened room of the central station. "The boat has deviated from Cape Charles to the east 4 miles. I suggest we change course to 2-3-5. "Very well," Siegmund agreed. "XO, get the eggs ready to drop." "Yes, Herr Captain," I replied. "Do you want me to cook them hard-boiled?" Those present on the bridge laughed out loud. We were glad that no one was following the boat approaching Rybaki Island. Someone imitated the battle cry of the Redskins. Everyone imagined themselves painted Indians attacking the enemy in canoes. I ordered to flood the 4 bow torpedo tubes and keep them open. U-230 accelerated, passing Rybaki on the starboard side. Our direction finder was probing the water. Prager was determining the bearing. The presence of the boat was still not detected. Halfway between Cape Charles to the north and Cape Henry to the south, Sigmund turned the boat around to head for the shallows of Chesapeake Bay. Amazingly, there was not a single enemy patrol ship to block our way as the lights of Norfolk became clearly visible on our port side. The American sailors must have been celebrating some kind of festivities that night, and they were obviously not concerned with us. As we passed the naval base, the silhouette of the lighted city was clearly visible in the night sky. As we moved further into the bay, the land became more and more closely encircled. At 2 o'clock in the morning, we picked up several transport ships heading for the open sea. Their sudden appearance foiled our plans to lay mines that night. We had no time to go underwater. The only thing left was to retreat into the darkness. U-230 made a complete U-turn that went unnoticed and hurried out of the bay before a group of transport ships had to do so. We saw one of them turn north. The other three turned in a fan to the south. Then they all dissolved into the night gloom. We proceeded eastward, covering 30 miles in 2 hours. The U-230 then lay low in shallow water and waited for the next night. July 28, at 9:45 p.m., when the last rays of the sun were extinguished, we surfaced and hastened at full speed back to Chesapeake Bay. Again, we crossed the line Cape Charles to Cape Henry. To the left was Norfolk. The American fleet was again celebrating something in the harbor. The bay was empty, with only the U-230 breaking the serenity of the night. About midnight, Borchert noticed a shadow beginning to suddenly increase directly in front of us. We immediately slowed down, but the shadow grew so quickly into a hulk that Siegmund was forced to stall both diesels, avoiding a collision with the stern of the merchant ship. It was evidently bound for Baltimore. The merchantman was moving too slowly, at a speed of only 8 knots, upsetting our traffic schedule. But since we could not order its captain to hurry up, we were forced to follow the vessel's keel at slow speed. For a few minutes we looked through binoculars at the nature of America. Conflagrations. I saw Siegmund's face turn deathly pale after this news. He had not touched food that day, secluded in his corner behind a curtain. Everyone sympathized with the commander, as they knew that his family lived in Hamburg, his wife, children, as well as his parents. When the fires in Hamburg went out after the bombing, it was found that 41,000 of its inhabitants had been killed and over 600,000 left homeless. August 1. Having removed about 400 miles from the coast of the Chesapeake Bay, we ventured to send a radiogram to headquarters. The special task has been accomplished. Waiting for new instructions. We are in need of fuel. 27S. Nin. 68.3. D. U-230. 3 hours after our radio session, 2 4-engine airplanes suddenly descended on us from the sky. We made an emergency dive in confusion. Aircraft bomb bursts rumbled around us. That day we went underwater 4 more times. It was clear that the radiogram provoked the activation of search operations of the U.S. aircraft. As night fell, we were ordered to head south through the Caribbean Sea to the area east of the Leeward Islands. There we were to be refueled by the submarine tanker U-459. 2 hours later, Riedel decoded a personal radiogram from headquarters. U-230. To Sigmund, the family is safe, all healthy. Taken out of town. Dennitz. This radiogram meant more to the commander and the team than a reward for the successful completion of the mission. We continued cautiously southward. Urgent dives and airplane attacks became habitual. Then on August 3, we received a radiogram from headquarters, the most important since the beginning of the turning point in the submarine warfare in favor of the Allies. To all submarines patrolling at sea, turn off the methox immediately. The enemy is intercepting its signals. Maintain radio silence until further notice. The warning from headquarters came to the U-230 in time, but it was too late for nearly 100 of our subs sunk before it. We suddenly realized that in our attempts to escape we had resorted to a device that revealed our coordinates as clearly as burning lights illuminate a Christmas tree. For weeks and months, we sent the enemy invitations to our own funeral. The news was monstrous. It made our survival even more problematic. With relief, we turned off the methox and continued south. However, hopes of returning to port became elusive when it became clear that the submarine tanker was not responding to calls from headquarters. During these days in early August 1943, U-230 changed course 3 times in attempts to reach the refueling submarine, and each time she failed to report to the rendezvous point, dooming us to wander aimlessly. Whatever the reasons for these mystical no-shows, our situation was worsening, as the boat's fuel supply was dwindling by the day. On August 9, our long, weary wait was interrupted by a new tragedy. Again, it touched 3 of our boats. It began with a radiogram intercepted from a submarine that was helplessly cruising 400 miles from the Brazilian port of Recife. Attacked by an airplane. Severe damage. Cannot dive. U-604. To save the boat's crew, headquarters ordered U-172 and U-185, which were near the boat's wreck, to go to the rescue. Radio silence surrounding the incident lasted about 30 hours. Then on August 11, a radiogram crossed the Atlantic. Attacked by aircraft. We have damage. U-172. And just a few minutes later, another radiogram. Attacked by a liberator. We're sinking. U-604. We intercepted a 3rd radiogram about an hour later. Rescued crew of U-604. Aircraft shot down. We have damage. U-185. Subsequent radiograms revealed that U-172 also took on board some of the crew of U-604. U-185 helped her make hasty repairs. Both boats then began the 3,000-mile passage to their home port. U-185 did not return. On August 24, she was sunk by an air attack. By August 13, the U-230 had only 2 tons of fuel left. We were 300 miles east of Barbados. At noon, we received by radio the coordinates of the place and time of rendezvous with the new refueling boat U-117 in Grid Square DR-64. The rendezvous was to take place on August 17. In order not to give ourselves away, we moved during the day in a submerged position at low speed in order to conserve battery power. At night, we followed in a surface position at a moderate speed, parting with every liter of fuel as if it were our own blood. Nevertheless, we arrived at the assigned area exactly at the appointed time. The boat slowly cruised there until it had used up all the fuel. Then, drifting helplessly, we noticed a black speck a few miles away. It was advancing cautiously toward us, but instead of meeting the refueler, we said hello to our old friend Dalhouse with the U-634, a boat that was also scheduled to refuel from the U-117 that day. The refueler never arrived. After almost 2 days of tense waiting, Dalhouse and Siegman agreed that U-634, which still had 15 tons of fuel, would sail 150 miles westward and then report our position to headquarters. Thus, we would remain safe, even if the Allies intercepted the radiogram and concentrated forces at the point of transmission. U-634 is gone. For several hours we remained in the same place, diving underwater as the enemy approached. After 10 hours of waiting, we intercepted Dalhouse's radiogram to headquarters, then began to wait with even greater impatience for a reply from headquarters. It came on August 20, raising new hopes. U-634. Share fuel with U-230. Both submarines to move to the square DF-91. August 27 to refuel from U-847. Return to base by the shortest route. After 46 hours of absence, Dalhouse finally returned. To avoid the risk of refueling during the day, both boats dived underwater and waited for sunset. At dusk, we surfaced and got our share of fuel from the U-634. We also discussed plans to meet up with Dalhouse's boat and the refueler in 5 days. The two boats then parted ways. On a quiet, calm night, we took a course to the east. During the day, we moved in a submerged position until we reached the middle of the Atlantic. Here, the pursuit from the air ceased. On the night of August 27, we arrived at the place of meeting with the refueler and began to look for familiar silhouettes. Already in the morning, we noticed 3 cuttings on the calm surface of the sea. When all the boats gathered in one place, the superstructure of a large refueling boat, U-847, appeared from under the water. With her appearance, we became 5. We greeted U-634 and U-415, congratulated U-172, which had saved half of the crew of U-604. The meeting of 5 submarines carried great dangers. We could only hope that the enemy had not managed to find out about it. U-634 and U-415 did not waste time. They docked at the sides of the refueling tanker and began to pump out of it the fuel. A few hours later, Dalhouse handed the fuel hoses to us, and U-230 took 15 tons of precious fuel. Soon, U-415 finished refueling and gave way to U-172. As U-415 pulled away, we wished her a safe return to Brest. I would have added a word of prayer to that if I were a prophet, because 7 months later, I became captain of U-415. Since we were completely helpless during refueling, the artillery crews took their places at the guns. In the event of enemy planes appearing, we were ready to instantly free ourselves from the fuel hoses and open fire. That's not how the refueling crew behaved. Its crew members stood on the edges of the fence of the vast bridge, like idle streetgawkers. In indignation, I shouted to the XO U-847 over the megaphone. "Why do your guys behave like that? Aren't you afraid of airplanes?" "We haven't met a single one since Greenland," he answered me. "You'd better rethink your attitude. Where are you going from here?" "Japan," he said carelessly. "But after we hand over 50 tons of fuel, I suppose we'll only get as far as Surabaya." Shaking my head, I wished him luck. Shortly thereafter, we disconnected our hoses and left the unsafe rendezvous point. After making a short regular dive, surfaced and cautiously followed in the keel of our predecessors on a direct course to port. 2 hours later, the refueling boat broke radio silence and reported to headquarters that it had refueled all 4 boats. With this, U-847 not only jeopardized the refueled boats, but also decided her fate. Within minutes, the British Radio Intercept Service had located the position of the refueler, and 3 hours later she was attacked by an American plane and sent to the bottom, becoming a steel tomb for the entire crew. In the afternoon, I could hear over the stern the reverberations from the bursting of many bombs. U-847 died a ridiculous death. Like the other 3 subs, U-230 did not have enough fuel reserves to maneuver at will. We were forced to take the shortest route past the Azores. Rounding them at noon on August 30, we intercepted a radiogram from Dalhouse, who had gone first, convoy heading north, attacked by a patrolman. U-634. A few minutes after receiving the radiogram, we heard a monstrous rumble of depth bomb explosions coming from the place where Dalhouse's boat was supposedly located. The bombardment continued with increasing force for more than 4 hours. After that, the U-634 never made contact again. She was sunk with her entire crew. After U-230 passed 20 degrees west longitude, attacks from the air became more frequent. From here, the Valley of Death began. We decided to stay underwater all night and move to the surface during the day if the sky was cloudless. But the British dominated the air, and the whole Bay of Biscay was shuddering from their bombardment. We dashed through falling bombs, machine gun bursts, and stormy seas. We managed to cover a few measly miles a day. The nights brought relief, but not for long. We broke through the formation of patrol ships, dodging their radar pulses sent by long-range radars, as well as an endless series of depth charges. After 7 difficult days, we finally saw the rocky shores of Brittany rise out of the sea. It was September 8, almost 10 weeks after we left port. We met the escort minesweeper before entering Brest Bay. It was the moment when the submariners changed into fresh uniforms and tiredly pushed their way onto the deck to smoke their first cigarettes in weeks. At the same time, our doctor rose from his bunk and showed his blackened, suffering face to those who had long forgotten his existence. Sigmund put a large cigar into his mouth, covered with a bright red Viking beard, and puffed it with a satisfied look. Having hiked under the magical umbrella of safety, we had once again thwarted the enemy's most elaborate attempts to lay us on the ocean floor next to our fallen comrades. As soon as the U-230 pulled into one of the concrete shelter stands, Friedrich climbed onto the bridge, wearing a straw hat and with a black beard framing his pale face. In his hand he held a porcelain cup. Gladmus saluted and handed the cup to Sigmund. "I want to surprise you, Herr Captain," he said. "Here is all that we managed to extract from our tanks. A few drops of fuel oil, and nothing else." Sigmund smiled. "You see, Chief Engineer, that's an indication of how efficiently I've been running the boat. You should give me credit. I always leave fuel on reserve." The reception of our boat's crew in Brest reflected the tense state of affairs and was overshadowed by the general despondency over the endless string of losses. On the pier of a large concrete shelter stood a few men in naval uniforms and 2 girls who had taken the time to greet us with bouquets of flowers. The traditional feast in the military town was well organized, but the general mood was not in any comparison with the cheerful, festive atmosphere of the previous meetings. I soon retired to my room and found my personal belongings neatly stacked on the floor. In a pigskin valise I found my will and tore it to shreds. Thus ended my longest hike. Then it was time for the ritual of reincarnation. Under a hot shower I was reborn, and when I cut my hair and shaved, I reached my age. After that I was going to visit Vera, whose plans for spending time with me after the trip had been thought out while I was still at sea. I was trying to remember how to tie my tie when Fred Schreiber, my partner in many adventures on land, entered the room with a half-empty bottle of champagne. Well, he began casually. "Someone seems to be getting ready to celebrate his return. How long have you been at sea? 10 weeks, you say? Let me make a wager with you. Come on, Fred, what's on your mind?" "I bet she left with another guy in a Navy uniform. You can't leave a girl for 10 weeks and expect her to wait for you. That's it. Let's drink our way through the bitterness of female infidelity." I could hardly refrain from contradicting him. After all, my girlfriend was waiting for me here in the army camp. "Meanwhile," Fred continued, "why don't you spend this evening with us? We are going to organize a big feast at the photographer's studio. There will be girls, champagne, a band, and more. Burke's girlfriend is celebrating her birthday, inviting everyone over." Did I just hear that? "Fred, who's the girl organizing the party?" "Ooh la la, you don't stand a chance. That's Vera, the photographer. She and Burke are inseparable." It was the downfall of my highest expectations. I filled my glass with Fred's champagne and poured the bitterness of loss into it. I told Fred I'd already arranged another date. When he came out, I lit a cigarette and tried to dispel the unhappy mood. After all, I couldn't demand anything from Vera. The pretty girl in the harbor was being courted by many of the men who were lucky enough to stay ashore. Apparently, Vera did not expect my return. The life expectancy of a submariner who participated in combat operations was 6 or 7 months, no more. Instead of visiting Vera, Riedel, Friedrich, and I celebrated my return at the restaurant, See the Commandant, which could offer a hungry sailor anything he wanted. Our submarine was supposed to be modernized during the repairs. On the U-230 were to be installed 2 double-barrel and 1 4-barrel anti-aircraft guns, which had long been expected. The firepower of 8 barrels would certainly make the pilot of an enemy airplane think twice before approaching the sub for a bombardment. A new radar receiver, called a boog, was also to be installed in place of the obsolete Metox. I was told that the boog would be able to find radio waves in the centimeter range. If so, it could give us advance warning of attacks, especially at night. After all, our refusal to Metox forced the enemy to improve the means of detection of submarines. In addition, we adopted torpedoes of a new design. These and other new weapons promised us the return of favorable trends in submarine warfare. However, time had already been lost. In July, we lost 37 submarines. 10 of the 17 that attempted to cross the Bay of Biscay during the second half of that month never returned to base. Another 16 subs were destroyed in August. In 4 months, the Allies had sunk more than 100 subs, almost 60% of the entire operational submarine fleet. As a consequence, our ability to destroy enemy ships dropped from a record tonnage of 1 million registered gross tons in March to 96,000 tons in August. Many of my friends and acquaintances were gone forever. The seats in the officers' mess hall were empty. No more laughter, no more fun. We, who had been spared so far, had enough reason to suppose that we ourselves would soon disappear into the depths of the ocean. The harbor routine quickly supplanted the gloom and stress. The crew gave themselves to submarine affairs and love affairs with equal fervor. The captain departed to report to Denitz and to attend a refresher course to get an update on the military situation. Our doctor was written off the submarine and sent to the Austrian Alps to recuperate after a nearly fatal campaign. Headquarters finally abandoned the idea of manning the subs with doctors. Most of the doctors who were suitable for work in the submarine fleet died with the submarines, and medical assistance was now needed everywhere. It followed from the imminent equipping of the submarine with torpedoes of a new design that I was to undergo a short course of training in the new technique at Gotenhafen in the Baltic. The unexpected order pleased me. But before leaving, I found time to visit my tailor. He was surprised to see me, for our troubles were no secret to the French. The suit was hanging on the rack. It was sewn perfectly. To add to my closet, I bought a gabardine coat, silk shirts, and fashionable sports shoes. It was the 4th year of the war, but the French still managed to get all kinds of goods at a reasonable price. I could afford to pay. There were no maidens, no bars, no feasts at sea. 5 days after the return of the U-230 from the campaign, I was on a train to Paris. In my pigskin valise, there was a neatly folded civilian suit. On arrival, I stopped at a familiar hotel near the Place Vendôme and changed into civilian clothes. It was the first time in 4 years that I had parted with my sailor's uniform for a while. Paris now lay at my feet. The city pulsed with life exactly as I had imagined it. My desire to immerse myself in a peaceful environment grew with each passing day of the war. I wanted to be among the lucky ones who didn't care about the days ahead, filled with the rumble of diesel engines running, depth charges exploding, and death in steel coffins. I wanted to forget that I was a small cog in a war machine that brought misery everywhere. I wanted to live again, not as a soldier, but as a carefree citizen, to taste a life free of oppressive duty, if only for one day. It seemed to me that I could satisfy my aspirations for a free and carefree life only in one place, Paris. Paris did not disappoint me. It charmed me as always. I felt the rhythm of the city's life, as well as the representatives of different nations. Free from the constraints imposed by the military uniform, I wandered the Parisian streets and wide avenues with pleasure. I realized that my disguise as a civilian had succeeded when I caught glances from Parisian beauties who would not condescend to look at a man in uniform. For 12 full hours I forgot all about the war. I arrived in Frankfurt in uniform and spent my time with my parents and sister. There was no shadow of the tension between my father and mother caused by his affair and the ensuing trouble with the Gestapo. But not all was well in Frankfurt. The destruction in the city had assumed monstrous proportions compared to what I had witnessed on my previous visit home in June. Huge areas of the city were mangled in the same manner as in Berlin. During the last air raid, my father's factory had sustained damage that had been hastily repaired. I was told that 6 fires had been put out in the attic of my father's warehouse in 2 nights alone, and that a small fire had broken out in our house. All this news was depressing, and I felt a vague guilt for our failure to interrupt the supply of American planes to Britain, which were now raining bombs on German cities. I rejoiced secretly that the business trip allowed me to spend only a few hours at home. That night I departed Frankfurt in a darkened train car. Several times the train stopped in the woods and open fields, forcing me to listen to the deafening long rumble of hundreds of Allied bombers crossing the night sky of Germany. The trip to Berlin was now long and grueling. I arrived in the capital 8 hours late. I traveled across the city on the subway, remembering the happy days of my meetings with Marianne. After her death, Berlin had lost its appeal for me. I left the city by a familiar route to the Baltic coast, but again late. I rode in a railroad car for 2 dreary nights. The carriage was lit only by flashes of matches and the glowing tips of cigarettes and cigars with a terrible odor. Smoke and stench reigned in the crowded compartments. Everywhere there was talk of war, which made the non-participating military and civilians listen. I was very interested in the morale of the civilian population and the military, especially the soldiers who had returned from the Eastern Front. They told me about the events that took place there, without losing faith in victory. This strengthened my opinion that we, who fought in the Atlantic, could count on the resilience of our troops in Russia. Allied landings in southern Italy, expected after the collapse of our front in Cyrenaica and North Africa, did not seem to shake the general confidence in victory. The train pulled into the station building at Danzig 10 hours late. I transferred to another and arrived a day later than scheduled at the military camp of the naval base at Gotenhafen. The submariners who had gathered there to study the effects of the new radar being adopted were impatient. A practical demonstration of the action of the new weapons was scheduled for the evening. The cove plunged into the darkness of the warm night. I boarded a passenger boat, which in its best days before the war carried passengers between the ports of Germany and Sweden. When the boat reached the middle of the bay, the officer in charge of the torpedo arsenal addressed the guests with the following words: "Gentlemen, we intend to demonstrate to you the action of 2 new types of torpedoes, which will revolutionize torpedo warfare. First, we will show you the destroyer killer T5 and the acoustic torpedo with great potential. Then you'll see the new multi-purpose LUT torpedo. Both torpedoes are battery-powered. For demonstration purposes, they are equipped with luminous warheads to track their movement at night." Our boat increased speed dramatically. A few minutes later, I noticed a green iridescent light in the dark water, rapidly approaching our vessel. As the boat turned left, the light followed. Then we turned right. The light continued to follow us. The glowing torpedo came even closer. Then the boat took sharp zigzag maneuvers to get away from it. However, the fish did not lag behind. It came even closer to us and finally disappeared under the stern. This was the moment when the explosion should have occurred. But the training torpedo continued to move according to the program. It overtook its target, turned 180 degrees, attacked the boat again, passing under its keel, made a neat loop, repeated its serpentine maneuvers, and once again passed under us before its batteries ran out. Then the torpedo surfaced like a dead fish, gleaming in the dark water. It was a stunning sight. I now realize that there was a weapon that could be countered by fast destroyers and patrol boats. This demonstration was followed by another impressive display. A number of glowing torpedoes were launched across the sea at once, searching for a target and making circular motions. They drew a series of lines on the surface of the water, coming within the angle of attack of our boat. Again followed a series of complex maneuvers until the torpedoes did not run out of batteries. Impressed by what I had seen, I engaged in a 3-day course, like a young cat anxious to try out its grown claws. Torpedo Killer Escorts was equipped with a homing device that reacted to the noise of rotating propellers and, if the ship is stationary, the sound of running electric motors. It was enough to launch the torpedo in the direction of the target. It determined its own course and caught up with the target regardless of what she resorted to maneuvers to avoid defeat. Another addition to our arsenal was designed to solve other problems. Recently, it has become unusually difficult and dangerous to approach the convoy at a distance convenient for attack. The new torpedo LUT removed this problem. It could be launched at a considerable distance from the convoy. Torpedo could move to the target according to a given program, making complex maneuvers on the surface of the sea and underwater. Several such torpedoes, fired at a certain depth of immersion, could create an impassable barrier in the path of the convoy, saving us from the need to overcome its dense combat guard. I left Copenhagen delighted with the new weapons and stories of other curiosities. I had heard of the miracle boats now being built in all the free shipyards. They could stay underwater indefinitely and maneuvered there as fast as they did on the surface. These new submarines were equipped with a retractable tube-shaped mast with a schnorkel float that allowed the boat in the submerged position to ventilate the compartments and recharge the batteries. This device seemed to me so important for the viability and combat effectiveness of the submarine that I decided, on my return to Brest, to find out whether it could be used on conventional submarines. Unrestricted submergence would help to solve all our problems. For the first time in months, I believed that we would get a weapon that could save our lives, or at least cost us dearly. We might yet catch a turning point in the war in our favor. When I arrived in Berlin, air raid sirens were howling. When I left, the air was saturated with the smell of burnt gunpowder and carbon monoxide from the ashes. Once again, the night express train, crowded with passengers, traveled to Paris with the lights off. Europe was engulfed in fire and chaos. The front was felt everywhere. In cities and towns, in the souls of the train's terrified passengers. 5 hours from Paris, I spotted a girl. She had boarded a train at Chalon-en-Marne. In the dark compartment I could not see her face well, but I inhaled the fragrance of perfume, which was sold in almost all perfume stores on the Boulevard Haussmann in Paris. First, as a matter of common gallantry, I helped her to stow her luggage. Then, when the lights of the small station illuminated the girl's face for a few seconds, I found her quite attractive. We made light-hearted conversation, followed by her not-so-light-hearted offer to show me Street Denis, the northern suburb of Paris where she lived. Paris without Street Denis, she argued, is like wine without alcohol. The girl's name was Marguerite. She introduced me to Saint Denis and many other parts of the city. We spent 2 wonderful days together in Paris. I was dressed in a civilian suit, and according to Marguerite, she was pleased with my French appearance. We wandered through bright streets, through parks fragrant with the smell of autumn leaves. Then came the second, and perhaps the last night of my life in Paris. We agreed to meet the next time I came to Paris. A parting followed, which brought me back to the everyday life of the war. When I arrived in Brest, the military town was in turmoil. The radio had just announced the surrender of Italy. This news was the main topic of conversation in the officers' mess hall and bar. After Anglo-American troops had established a beachhead for their landing at Salerno, the new government of Marshal Badoglio had ordered Italian soldiers to lay down their arms. Now the German troops had to fight the enemy one-on-one. Fortunately, we had strong defensive positions there, allowing us to stop the enemy advancing northward. But it became obvious that the ring of steel around Europe was getting tighter and tighter. The day of my stay coincided with the completion of the scheduled repair and refitting of the U-230 in dry dock. I began her preparation for the inevitable campaign. Our supply of torpedoes of the new type was, however, tight. We received only 1 escort killer, T5, 8 self-propelled torpedoes, LUG, and 3 of the usual type. I inquired about the possibility of receiving a schnorkel, but met only surprised faces. No one at the base had even heard of such a device. Nevertheless, the formidable appearance of our boat and the installation of 8 anti-aircraft guns on it were encouraging. These rapid-firing anti-aircraft guns, outlandish torpedoes, and a new type of radar gave us a good chance to regain our former glory days, as well as a chance to return to port after the campaign. October 4, Monday. U-230 put to sea at dusk. We were favored by a moonless night. As soon as the rocky coastline dissolved into darkness, we parted company with our escort and headed on a course southwest directly into the Valley of Death. A few minutes later, our new radar signaled the appearance of the enemy. Instead of an immediate dive, we continued to move full speed across the surface of the sea, preparing our anti-aircraft guns for battle and resorting to a new diversionary tactic, which we were assured would be very effective. Riedel, who was responsible for implementing this tactic, filled a balloon with helium stored in tanks secured to the bridge railing. He then attached strips of aluminum foil to the string that held the balloon together and tied the free end to the float. The whole structure was thrown overboard. The float stayed on the surface of the sea, and the balloon rose, pulling the string until it looked like a Christmas tree. The floating dummy quickly disappeared astern in the ominous darkness. 5 minutes later, Riedel repeated the operation, and a second mock-up bobbed on the waves of the Bay of Biscay. These aluminum trees were intended to misdirect the enemy's radar and allow us to evade pursuit ourselves by hiding behind an artificial forest. Unfortunately, 2 other balloons became entangled in the bridge railing, and 3 others tore while filling with gas. The fluttering ends of the tangled foil strips could have led the enemy to the boat. We were lucky, however. While Riedel was fiddling with the foil strips and balloons, we slipped into a space occupied by French fishing schooners, which protected us more than the floating models and anti-aircraft guns. Eventually, we threw all our aluminum trees overboard and never used them again. They endangered us rather than saved us. We zigzagged among the fishing boats, scattered chaotically over a wide area, for most of the night, and advanced quite a distance. Then continued the cat and mouse game with death. Bug worked flawlessly. Several times he warned us in advance of the enemy's approach, giving us plenty of time to dive. Each time Tommy circled above us in bewilderment. When the British realized that we had new radar to warn us of danger, they changed their patrol schedule around the boat's intended course in such a way as to force us underwater more often. As a result, by the end of the first night of the trip, the batteries were 70% depleted. However, having such a reliable electronic aid as the boot, which enabled us to avoid encounters with bombers, we abandoned the summer tactics and no longer attempted to move in a surface position in daylight. The next night, the British reacted instantly to our surfacing. Switching on their radars only sporadically, they took us by surprise with their precisely timed strikes. Hour after hour, we made alternate diving and surfacing. Night after night, we escaped from the cunning maneuvers and merciless attacks of the enemy. On the 7th night, the number of attacks decreased, and on the 8th night, we were able to surface for fresh air. U-230 broke out of the blockade zone and continued westward among the glowing waves. On the 9th night, we received orders to follow the grid of square AK-64 and take up position in the forward watch. All submarines entering it were to be in a submerged position to detect the approaching convoy by acoustic means. Surface surfacing was allowed only for a very short time. It was necessary at all costs to ensure the secrecy of our presence, for it was a decisive condition for success. On October 15 at 20.35, we intercepted with our new antenna, capable of picking up radio waves at a depth of 30 meters, a radiogram. Convoy, grid square AK-61, heading west. Surfacing for attack. U-844. One of the wolves made contact with the convoy. The trap worked. 21.00. U-230 surfaced just as the last glimmer of day was fading, which underwater we did not see. Somewhere behind the dark veil of night, a convoy was moving north, against which a wolf pack attack was being prepared. As usual, we had high hopes for the attack. 23.50. Worker detected the first shadows. Escort, starboard bow, 3,000 meters. The destroyer showed her broadside and disappeared into the darkness. The trembling voice of a sailor sounded. Watchman, 2,000 meters, 0 crumble. Sigmund's command followed. Both diesels to triple speed. Chief engineer, go full throttle. The last instruction was to Friedrich, who had to squeeze all the reserves from the hard-working engines. There was no question of attacking the patrol ship with a killer torpedo. On bearing 100, another shadow emerged from the darkness. A patrolman left on the bow. It was slowly moving between our submarine and the destroyer that was pursuing us. Siegmund didn't miss his chance. He turned the U-230 to the left and sped off in a northerly direction at 20 knots. Both escorts were forced to maneuver desperately to avoid collision. Because of this, however, contact with the convoy was lost for some time. It was already 00.15 on October 16. 2. 3 course corrections, taking into account the convoy's speed, distance, and angle of attack. Siegmund led the submarine on a course of intersection with the right column of the convoy, relying on the ability of the watch officer to assess the situation behind our stern. I aimed, set target parameters, aimed again. Now the Pua's reticle froze in the very center of the huge transport, then lurched in anticipation. 10 seconds, 20, 30, and here are 2 fan salvos. 4 torpedoes popped out of the apparatuses. Siegmund turned the boat and led her parallel to the convoy course, knocking off the trail of escorts. 1 torpedo struck the largest shadow right in the middle. A huge spume of flame shot up into the sky, then the deafening rumble of an explosion. A few seconds later, the shockwave ruffled our beards. It was the signal for the battle to begin. Stars of flares rose, illuminating the armada. I waited for the transports to fall apart and for the other torpedoes to hit their targets. But at that moment, the convoy made a turn in accordance with the set course. Then a new flash and a new rumble of explosions sounded in the night. It was as if a volcano had erupted. The columns of transports upset. Spumes of flame and flare bombs slowly descending on parachutes painted the sky a red-golden color. It had been a disaster like this we hadn't seen in a long time. I asked the captain's permission to fire a killer torpedo. It meant reducing the boat's defensive capabilities, but it wasn't always possible to hit targets so easily. "All right," said the captain, "but hurry up." Siegmund sent the watchman below. I gave the last command before the shot. Apparatus 5. Go. Angle of attack to starboard 90. Fire. Alert. U-230 quickly dived underwater to avoid being the target of its own homing torpedo. When the boat leveled off at a depth of 120 meters, there was another explosion. All hell seemed to break loose. Escorts frantically searched for the culprit of the attack on the convoy, foaming the surface of the sea with frantically rotating propellers. Nearby, a series of depth charges rumbled through the water. The pulses of the Aztec rushed into the deep ocean. However, the rumbling noise of propellers and engines of the many transports of the convoy covered our departure and pleased our ears. When the tension of the situation gradually subsided, torpedoists and sailors vigorously undertook to prepare torpedo apparatuses for reloading. 03.10. We surfaced and reloaded. The night darkness was impenetrable. The sea agitation increased. U-230, launched in pursuit of the fleeing convoy, shook violently. Suddenly, at a distance of 3 miles on the starboard side of the light came on. We turned and moved slowly in that direction. As we gradually approached, we saw a searchlight beam aimed at the sinking vessel. Nearby was a patrol boat, taking on board sailors from the lost transport. We quietly crept up to the place of rescue operation and watched it not without interest. The helpless escort was a convenient target. It was only 800 meters in front of our torpedo apparatus, exposing its broadside to a deadly torpedo strike. But Siegmund, obeying a sense of pity and the unwritten law of honor, said, "To hell with them, with these tin cans. Let's look for transports." Left rudder, small forward. The U-230 slowly turned around so as not to give away its presence. A small, perfectly round spot of red appeared from behind the sinking vessel. It quickly grew into a glowing red ball. We realized that we were being followed by a destroyer, which was now hunting for the boat using night vision equipment. Immediately, The engines were switched to full power, and the boat roared forward. The escort gave chase, lunging with all their might at the crashing waves. Though the hunter lurching and bouncing desperately on the waves, he persisted in closing the distance between him and us. Siegmund, however, had a slight advantage in his choice of course. He steered the boat in zigzags through the crashing waves. From time to time the captain asked, his voice overpowering the rumble of the storm, "What's the matter with the escort, XO?" Going at the same speed, I shouted back over my shoulder, not wanting to admit to myself that I had lost the opportunity to fire a killer torpedo at the hunter. The escort was approaching, and had already acquired the clear outline of a warship. However, the strength of the wind was increasing the agitation of the sea. The mighty waves were hitting the destroyer harder than us, slowing it down. After 90 minutes of desperate maneuvering in the darkness among the maddening ocean, hunter disappeared from sight. 04.45. 2 hours before dawn, we detected a new shadow astern. We quickly followed a course to the north and almost collided with the convoy. The shadows moved straight ahead. 3, 5, 10. I looked around and identified my targets even without binoculars. Then everything happened very quickly. I prepared the torpedo tubes for firing, caught the Liberty transport in the reticle, pulled the lever, aimed the RPC at the other shadow, pulled the lever again. That's all I could do. A patrolman jumped out from behind the transport and came at us. U-230 went sideways and moved through the waves in the only course of salvation. We were almost finished moving in an arc when a column of fire erupted into the night. The blast wave and the rumble of the explosion hit us simultaneously. The sky turned red. The second torpedo passed us by. A new race began. The destroyer chased us astern in a desperate attempt to ram the boat if it could not be destroyed by other means. I regretted having used up my homing torpedo too soon. For the second time that night, we resorted to maneuvers to get out of danger, and managed to do so after an hour's deadly chase. Siegmund fearlessly led the boat into another battle. I ordered the torpedo tubes to be reloaded. The battle was not over, but as the eastern horizon brightened and dawn parted the sea and clouds, we realized we were on our own. In the early morning hours, the combat operation took a dramatic turn. Our overnight successes had alarmed the British. As might be expected, they sent to hunt for us all that could fly, from single-engine airplanes to long-range bombers. A massive air attack awaited us. 08.25. I noticed a 4-engine airplane darting out of the clouds and sounded the alarm. The boat pecked the nose and rushed into the depths of the ocean. After a few anxious minutes, 4 powerful explosions shook U-230 and reminded us that in the excitement of battle we forgot to turn on the Vug. After waiting out the aircraft attack and surfacing 40 minutes later, we again chased the elusive targets, carefully monitoring the sky and horizon. 09.15. Intercepted a radiogram. Attacked by a destroyer. 57 SH 24-3. D. Tonum. U-844. Our friends in distress, in the midst of the storm, could not be helped. But by reporting the coordinates of the scene of the tragedy, U-844 gave us a tip on the convoy. 09.23. Urgent diving due to approaching Liberator. The strong hull, responding to the work in the forced mode of vertical and horizontal rudders, quickly went underwater. 4 warheads exploded on the port side. 09.45. Resurfaced. The sky is deserted. 19.20. An alert for a Liberator. 4 devilish explosions followed our plunge into the depths of the sea. 10.50. We surfaced again and continued the search for the convoy. 11.12. Another distress signal from our boats was intercepted. Attacked by an airplane. Tonum. U-964. My sympathy for the crew of the dying boat was replaced by anxiety in connection with the appearance of an airplane on the radar screen. We dove underwater to a depth where we could not be reached by the depth bomb explosions, then surfaced again and again rushed in pursuit of the convoy. These scenes were repeated again and again. The alarms were inexorably followed by the explosions of depth bombs that shook the boat. Late in the afternoon, a new distress radiogram arrived. Airplane, bombs, Tonum, U-470. When night fell over the battle zone, we calculated that the 4 enemy transports sunk last night cost us 3 of our submarines. It was close combat. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The evil irony was that the British sank the boats that did them no harm. We, on the other hand, who had distinguished ourselves in the battle, continued to hunt for the convoy when the storm forced the planes to withdraw. Almost 3 hours after midnight, we intercepted a new distress signal from one of the subs attacking the flanks of the convoy. Attacked by a destroyer. We're sinking. U-631. The nightmarish night ended with the loss of 4 British transports and 4 of our subs. On October 17 at dawn, the Allies resumed their furious air attacks on the convoy hunters. The battle continued from dawn to dusk exclusively in favor of the British. We surfaced and moved forward in a desperate attempt to get a few miles. Again and again, however, we were attacked from the air, driven into the saving depths. At the end of the second day of the race, 2 more of our subs were sunk by bombers from the air. U-540 and U-841 reported that they had been attacked by airplanes and went to the bottom. The hunting stopped, but we suffered heavy losses. Of the entire pack, only our boat managed to escape. This was the general balance of life and death in the fall of 1943, with only one of the 7 returning to base. Since we had lost our convoy while we were evading air attacks, HQ ordered us to follow the grid of the VD-62 quadrant and await further instructions. As we moved into the assigned area, the weather improved considerably. The boat advanced extremely cautiously, submerging for long periods of time as soon as daylight appeared and surfacing in total darkness. Early in the morning of October 22, we arrived in the target area. During the day, the air temperature rose to 20 degrees Celsius, and the night was unusually calm. The silence was deceptive, but not for us. We had learned to sense danger like a mature bear, repeatedly wounded by hunting bullets, and we knew that a second of carelessness turns to death. That danger and the enemy were waiting for us everywhere. For several days our patience was severely tested. Hiding under cover of darkness, we zigzagged across the ocean, tracing an area wide enough for 3 convoys to pass through. When daylight drove us underwater, we lurked at a depth of 40 meters, groping the sea surface with a locator and listening to it with acoustic instruments. Then in the evening of October 26, a chance came. An acoustician heard a noise that could only come from the convoy. At 9:40 p.m. we surfaced. A month in a cloudless sky shone too brightly. It was completely windless. Our boat moved easily on the smooth silver surface of the sea, rumbling diesels. Straight ahead of us, at a distance of 6,000 meters, dragged the convoy. The horizon was dotted with black dots moving westward at a certain distance from each other. On the left flank of the convoy were 3 patrol vessels. Another escort loomed on the right flank, and one more at the tail of the Armada. The distances separating the escorts from each other varied considerably. Incredible as it may seem, we surfaced behind the battle guard formation. After a few minutes, the escorts turned one by one, and having noticed us, with sparks escaping with the clouds of smoke, rushed forward in order to prevent our attack. Sigmund drove the boat at full speed in a bold attempt to get to the edge of the convoy before the frantically maneuvering escorts could join their forces. Our zigzags confused the pursuers, but 3 enemy shadows steadily approached, casting waves off the foretop. It soon seemed as if we had fallen into a trap. However, so far nothing prevented the boat to go to the angle of attack. U-230 roared forward, quickly reducing the distance to the moving black monsters. The commander shouted, "XXO, I give you 40 seconds to fire." I was ready to meet this short period of time, having determined the distance to the target. Taking aim, calculating the time of movement, I fired 4 bow torpedoes at short intervals. Our boat tilted sharply, lying on a reverse course. A moment later, I pulled the trigger a 5th time, firing the last torpedo from the stern. It was the fastest attack we had ever made. As the 5 torpedoes raced westward, the U-230 tore eastward with 3 pursuing escorts astern. In the moonlight, the gray superstructures of the hunters shone white. After a few minutes of frequent heartbeats, a series of spolors of flame rose up near the western horizon. 2, perhaps 3 transports had been hit by our torpedoes. The clock showed 10:25 p.m. To our amazement, the escorts behind us at stone-throwing distance suddenly turned and raced back toward the attacked convoy. U-230 continued at full speed for another hour, then Seidman allowed the crew to relax. 3 hours after the British stopped chasing us, Radel reported to headquarters on the results of our attacks. Convoy BD-64, westbound, 3 hits, unable to trace the nature of the damage. 4 transports, totaling 26,000 tons of tonnage, sunk earlier, all torpedoes expended. Returned to base. Following the transmission of his radiogram, we took a course for the Bay of Biscay. Before the first rays of the sun could demask us, U-230 went underwater. As before, we moved in a surface position only at night. When crossed the invisible barrier, which enclosed the Bay Allies, attacks from the air became more frequent by the hour. In constant strain we followed, keeping our decks level with the surface of the sea. Fore and aft ballast tanks were slightly flooded with water for instant submergence. Every hour of the nightmarish passage through these dangerous waters might have been our last. On the 3rd night after the battle with the convoy, we were shaken by explosions from 16 drop-depth charges. On the 4th night, we dived 6 times and dodged 24, fairly accurately dropped ordnance cassettes. On the 5th night, 28 bombs were sent after us. On the 6th, the boat dived deep 5 times and dodged 20 bombs. On the 7th night, the number of air attacks decreased, but we went to the patrol area of the enemy hunter group with completely empty torpedo tubes. We managed to outsmart the enemy by moving slowly and maintaining silence. The boat's electric motors ran almost silently. Then, rid of the danger, the boat rushed eastward, rumbling diesels. By the end of the night, we were able to report to headquarters that we were only 10 hours away from the rendezvous with our escort. On November 5 at 9:30, the U-230 made a surfacing. For the first time in 18 days, we saw daylight. 2 minesweepers were waiting for us in the rough sea near the rocky coast of Brittany. One of them signaled us with a lamp. Air alert. Squadrons to anti-aircraft guns. We responded immediately. Apparently, the campaign wasn't over yet. Satanic force pursued us from above until we arrived in port. Finally, the U-230 took refuge in the concrete shelter of Brest. Only there, under the 7-meter thick reinforced concrete above our heads, we were out of reach of enemy planes. As soon as I crossed the gangway and took my first tentative steps on the hard ground, the concrete walkway conveyed a sense of security from my soaked boots to my soul and body. I took a heavy sigh. That sigh was the only way to express how I felt about our failures in the submarine warfare. Everything was against us now. Even our promising new homing torpedo had not performed as well in combat as it had under ideal test conditions. There was little we could sacrifice. 2 years ago, the front line in the west ran far out to sea. Last spring, it had moved eastward to the continental shelf. Now the front ran along the very coast of France. Many of the U-boats that had somehow managed to survive the few days of the campaign were sunk in front of our shore services moments before their crews could step onto the concrete pier. Brest Bay itself could serve to illustrate the dramatic difference between past and present. I noticed that many of the submarine parking lots in the concrete bunker were empty. Last spring, 3 subs crammed into each bunker, while others were forced to wait their turn outside at the open dock. I noticed that there was silence in the dry dock. Not so long ago, it had been bustling with activity. Submarines were being repaired there 24 hours a day, and if the boats were hunting convoys. No, there weren't many left in the Atlantic, but each of them attacked alone simply to keep the enemy from rolling up his costly anti-submarine defense system. In October, 24 subs were sunk, some of them killed in a hail of aerial bombs, others by new, more advanced warheads. The results of our campaign were a surprisingly large contribution to the total Allied losses suffered from U-boats. However, the many empty seats in the officers' mess hall kept us from being proud of our accomplishments. The breath of death was felt everywhere. My first breakfast in port was accompanied not only by early fresh vegetables, but also by more bad news. Strachmeyer, one of the staff officers, reported that 3 of my fellow students and close friends had perished at sea. Another had found death aboard the submarine when an explosion blew apart the forward set of batteries. The boat returned to port, but my friend was buried in the Atlantic. Strachmeyer then stunned me with the news that Gerloff and Goebel, my shipmates on the U-557, had perished with their boats over the summer. Depressed at the sight of death, I said goodbye to Strachmeyer and went out into the adjoining room. A company of our immortals had gathered at the bar. The night was still young, but they were already drunk. Riedel was sporting a mustache, which he considered to be his main concern during our campaigns. Von Stromberg, Burke, and others were there. I joined the society, drinking and singing with them. We went through the entire repertoire of sea songs, some of which were sung to the tune of Link's tunes from the Light Beetle. Then we throated the chorus of our version of one popular song, with Bork playing along on the piano. If we go to the bottom of the ocean, we'd still make it to the shore. To you, Lily Marlene. To you, Lily Marlene. As often happened when we ran out of champagne, patience, or wit, we decided to visit Madame and her girls in the casino bar. Without removing my Navy uniform, I squeezed into a crowded automobile that sped through the night city. The casino bar was noisy, smoky, and bright. There were already a few buddies from the first flotilla there. We were greeted with cheers and cheering. Madame was as charming as ever, and her merchandise possessed characteristics that distinguished the casino bar from other establishments of its kind. She greeted me kindly, but with a touch of reproach. "Monsieur, we have not seen you for so long. I hope my girls have not treated you badly." No, it is not their fault. It is the fact that... I interrupted my explanation when I remembered that her establishment might be a center of Allied espionage. I was carried away by the tide, madame. I finished my answer. She offered to make my choice of partner, but I had no particular plans for the night. I sat at the bar sipping drinks, listening to loud music on the phonograph, watching my friends. Neither the damsels nor the champagne encouraged me, though oblivion in amusement was our chief desire in these gloomy days. I realized that the casino bar had lost its attraction for me. Just as the clock struck midnight, the air raid sirens began to wail. My friends hurried out of the establishment. The bombs didn't scare them. They just didn't want any accident to keep them out too long. It would hurt their reputations. The sirens continued to howl as we walked through the streets of Brest, listening to the thudding shots of anti-aircraft guns beating outside the city in the direction of Cape Kizan. Having no time to return to the military town, most of my friends used the bomb shelter before the planes appeared in the sky over Brest. I looked at the rips in the sky and saw that the Allies' main strike was on the southern part of the city. In the next few minutes, 7 or 8 bombers caught fire, dropped out of formation, and began to plummet downward in a graceful dive, leaving a sparkling plume behind them. The vastly improved heavy anti-aircraft artillery around Brest created such a spectacular sight that I forgot to take shelter. There was no need to do so, however. The remnants of the Allied air armada withdrew. Impressed by what we had seen, we didn't want to go to bed and joined a group of buddies at the bar for more champagne. But just as I was settling down on a high stool, the bar door opened and someone shouted, "The Americans are coming." We jumped up from our stools, glancing around incredulously, though after the Allied landings in Sicily and Italy, anything was possible. However, the young officer from the headquarters, who brought the news, hastened to add, "Calm down, gentlemen. I only meant that they are leading the captured American pilots whose planes have just been shot down. Most of them are wounded. Would you like to take a look?" The night was getting more and more interesting. I rushed to the naval hospital nearby to see the foreigners from across the ocean. The hospital courtyard was flooded with the light of numerous lamps. 2 or 3 times at intervals, trucks or ambulances drove in and stopped in a parking spot. Around them, orderlies, nurses, and mere gawkers crowded at the entrance. Victims of our anti-aircraft fire, badly burned, were brought in on stretchers. A doctor with whom I was acquainted allowed me to look into the waiting room. This was where new patients were brought in as soon as the previously delivered Americans were taken out for emergency surgeries. One of the Yankees, still wearing his flight jacket, seemed to be in better condition than his comrades, but he was rolling his eyes and shaking his head as if in agony. When I approached him, I saw that he had an ugly but rather superficial scar running from his forehead to his neck, dividing his head in 2. He had been cut short in the style of a Prussian officer. Seeing my enemy for the first time at such a close distance, I could not resist speaking to him, saying in English, "See, this is what you got for bombing our base. Does it hurt?" He didn't answer. Then I continued, "Tell me, how did you get that wound?" This time he moved his head slightly, as if surprised that the enemy was interested in his condition. Then he answered, "I got it when I threw myself out of the cockpit. The airplane was hit and burning. The other crew members had already ejected by parachute. I couldn't do it because the lantern wouldn't open. I rested my head against it and pushed it out until I broke it. That must have been how I cut myself. How I got to the ground, I don't remember." I was interested in his American accent. As for me, I was learning pure English. So, I said to him, "The war is over for you. Are you happy about that?" "The war may be over for me, but very soon it will be over for you Germans too." "What do you mean?" "You've heard it before. We'll wipe out your military bases and industry in a few months. Maybe a little longer. It doesn't matter." "We'll pay you back in a month," I said, indignantly. "Look, I don't know what they tell you about our military potential, but one thing I am sure of. Soon there won't be a single one of your airplanes left in the sky, and that will be the end of the war for you." I meant, of course, the use of our new weapons, including radiation and atomic bombs, which our specialists have been working on. There has been a lot of talk about that. "Well, yes," objected the American sarcastically. "You forget what happened to your subs. We cracked most of them in 6 months, and it'll be the same with everything else. You won't last long." I was struck by his awareness, but at the same time angered by his arrogance. "You're talking nonsense. Who told you we don't have any more subs?" "Don't we?" "No, we don't, and I'm living proof of it. I've just returned from a tour, and I can assure you there are many more submarines at sea. Soon there will be hundreds more, faster and more powerful. We will kick your fleet out of the ocean." That made me feel better. But the Yankee smiled skeptically and said, "Listen well to what I'm going to tell you. You'll remember it again, and very soon. Whatever you Germans did, it's too late now. Time is working for us, and only for us." Deciding that he was a typical victim of Allied propaganda, I patted the American on the shoulder and said, "You will see that the Germans are not as bad as your newspapers portray them. I wish you a speedy recovery. The day will come when you will realize that I am right." We smiled at each other, and I left. The Yankees' next stop was the operating table, and then a long rest behind barbed wire. By the time I got back to the military compound, it was afternoon, not a good time to sleep. I took my uniform and civilian suit out of my suitcases and hung them in the closet. Spreading the books on the table, I chose one of them and tried to read. The text was not perceived. The words of the American pilot about time working for them sounded in my ears. Anxiety gripped me. I started to reread the letters I had received from home. But the American's voice continued to echo between the lines. The air raids, my parents wrote, had intensified dramatically. They had killed one of my father's business buddies. The letters also reported that Trudy's husband came on vacation. The newlyweds spent 2 weeks in the Black Forest, where there were no night raids yet. The letters revealed to me the bitter fact that even at home the situation was getting worse. I continued to be haunted by the Americans' words. Early in the morning I took U-230 to Brest Bay to check its condition. The chief engineer of the flotilla determined the minimum repair work and their timing. The situation demanded a quick return to the front of the few submarines still afloat. Our old workhorse had to be cleaned, refueled, painted, and tidied up in 2 weeks. This meant that no one had time for vacation. I inquired a second time about the possibility of getting a schnorkel, but no one at the base could give me an intelligible answer to my inquiry. Instead, we were told that we would receive advanced radars capable of bearing wavelengths in the lower centimeter range. Thus, we would keep pace with the enemy's rapid progress in electronic warfare. In the brutal confrontation at sea, we were driven into a deafening defense. The Allies dictated our terms of war and weapons. For the weekend of the first week, I abandoned my submarine and harbor duties, taking the Friday night express to Paris. At night I changed in the train restroom into a civilian suit. According to prior arrangement, I met Marguerite under the Eiffel Tower. She was wearing a blue silk dress with embroidered flowers. We embraced, and I met eyes with the German soldiers passing by, envious of the intemperate Frenchman. Paris was warm and fragrant. In the clear air mingled the tart odors of falling leaves and water in the Seine, and the fragrance of perfume. Above us shone the sun, whose tender rays I had so often been deprived of at sea. It was a time when I forgot the bombings and the deaths, when it seemed to me that the real prospect of going to the bottom of the ocean would pass me by. Soon after my return to Brest, I was already changed into my naval uniform, and nothing betrayed my brief visit to another world. The commander was unexpectedly ordered to report to the superior officer of the West Branch at headquarters. We assumed that his visit had something to do with our upcoming march. After a day's absence, Siegmund returned and quickly summoned Friedrich, Rydell, and me to his office. Without preamble, he said, "Gentlemen, I will be brief. We are ordered to break through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean." Siegmund paused to observe our reactions. I forced a smile out of myself. My partners kept a grim expression on their faces. It was clear to everyone that any attempt to get through the narrow strait had minimal chance of success. But what did it matter where we went? It was the same everywhere. Desperate attempts to inflict damage on the enemy and avoid being wounded or killed by bombardment. As in the case of slow suicide, everywhere death was inevitable. Only the name of the sea in which we would go down would change. There was, however, one consolation. If we were lucky enough to pass the strait, the area of our operations would be the calm waters of the Mediterranean. To lighten the mood, I said, "All this reminds me of exotic places I'd like to visit. But how do we get there?" The captain was quick to pick up on my dark humor. "Gentlemen, if you keep the purpose of our trip a secret, we will be able to relax in January on the beaches of Italy." The tension subsided, and our conversation revived. But then Siegmund cooled us down again. He said that in early November, the British intercepted and sunk in the strait 2 of our submarines, U-742 and U-340. Other submarines sent to the strait died before they could reach it. On October 24, U-566 was sunk off the coast of Spain. The same fate befell U-966 on November 10. Nothing was known about the fate of U-134 and U-535, which apparently were sunk before they had time to transmit distress radiograms. The latest losses gave us a clear idea of what awaited us. While we were preparing for the campaign, the difference in losses was growing, not in our favor. By November 25, 15 more of our subs had been destroyed. Our impressive submarine fleet in the Atlantic, once a source of pride, had all but ceased to exist. All that we were able to oppose the Anglo-American technology. is the destruction by torpedoes of several ships of small convoys of the Allies with a tonnage of only 67,000 registered gross tons.